is my great pleasure to welcome Sue Murray to our gathering, our colloquium this week. And I want to thank, remind me who to thank.
Wen Hongchen is a Global Media Industry Speaker Series.
Okay, anyone else we should thank besides the RTF department and all the usual suspects?
I don't know whose professorships contributed.
And I don't know if some chip in on these deals, but anyway, it's great to have Sue back. Sue did her PhD here, finished in 1999. Her dissertation became her first book on broadcast, early television and broadcast stardom. She's co-edited a couple of editions of a terrific book on reality television, which I've used in classes here. And her most recent book is an award-winning tome that she will be speaking from today. She is a recently promoted full professor at NYU, which is great. I mean, that's a big deal. Effective this year, she's also the director of graduate studies in the department of, I always have trouble with this, media, culture, and communication. Has been at that university since September 2000. We were just talking about the fact that she started her gig at NYU on the day of 9/11. What a way to start there. And literally underneath, anyway, in the neighborhood, which is really something. So a couple of years at City College before that, and then and since 2001 at NYU. And has had a terrific career, and it's great always to have our graduate students do so well, and to be able to have them back. So join me in welcoming Sue Murray.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thank you to Mary Beltran, who helped organize everything, and also Lee Sparks, who organized things for my trip here, and for the invitation. It was so welcome, and it's a homecoming for me. I've been visiting, but I have not come back to the department. I visited Austin, but I haven't come back to the department since I graduated. So it's been amazing to be back, so I really appreciate it. And I was thinking about my book in relationship to the department, where I've long described myself, because I was also working with Janet, that I am a television historian that was really trained by film historians. And I feel like that's really represented in this book, the way that I wanted it to always be in conversation with other forms of media, not in terms of its isolation, and to connect those narratives together. So today I'm going to present just a bit of it, and also show you some clips and things, because this is such a visual book, and that was important for me with this book as well. I had to get grants to make sure that there were enough color images throughout that we could afford to do that, because I thought it was so central to the experience of the book and the larger arguments. Black and white was just not going to do it. But doing presentations also gives me a chance to show you some of the moving images. And in doing that, I'm going to start with this, which is, I'll play in the background, which is an early color test, actually, by CBS from 1949. The woman that you'll see is Patty Painter, who was CBS's color girl, who was a color test girl for Fidelity. Oh, wait. There are always technical issues. Let's see. Sometimes it's this. Just like when I teach my classes. There we go. Okay, so I'll let that play for a bit. So color television, even the term itself is now antiquated. We no longer need to specify color, right? While color television is now simply television, and the idea of black and white set seems distant and quaint, there was a time in which color TV was, to use a very contemporary term, a disruptor. Even though it was an assumed next step in the advancement of the technological extension of human sight, color TV was also a radical departure from the norms, procedures, and priorities set by the black and white standard. By the time color television sets came on the market in the early 1950s, at a point in time when most consumers had just purchased their first, less expensive black and white sets, and network programming itself was just beginning to take off, consumers and many working in the industry were simultaneously impressed by the images color produced and questioning how much they'd be willing to invest in it. Even as late as 1959, out of the estimated 45 million TV sets in use, only 1% were in color. It took over a decade of slow dissemination for all networks to convert their programming to color and for color set sales to reach a respectable level. Nevertheless, color TV was widely considered to be the most complex communication technology of its time. For example, and this is where we'll see another clip, a lesser-known exchange between Nixon and Khrushchev during the infamous kitchen debates at the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow went like this.
And I'm glad that he did so on our color television at such a time as this. Of course, later on we will both have the opportunity to speak this evening, and consequently I will not comment on the various subjects that he raised at this point, except to say this. This, Mr. Khrushchev, is one of the most advanced developments in communication that we have, at least in our country. It is color television, of course. It is, as you will see in a few minutes, when we will see the very picture of your speech and of my comments that has been transmitted. It's one of the best means of communication that has been developed. And I can only say that if this competition, which you have just described so effectively, in which you plan to outstrip us, and particularly in the production of consumer goods, if this competition is to do the best for both of our peoples and for people everywhere, there must be a free exchange of ideas. There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you see, you never concede anything. Wait till you see the picture.
I think it would be interesting for you to know that this program is now being recorded on Ampex's color tape, and it can be played back immediately, and you can't tell that it isn't a live program. Извините, и советские инженеры пришли и увидели это, и они восхищались.
Я тоже присоединяюсь к восхищению наших советских инженеров.
His face always cracks me up. So what's lost in this typical description of the meeting of these two political leaders is not only the specific references to color television as an advanced technology, comparable in its significance, according to Nixon, to space rockets, but also to the rhetorical framing of color video technologies as central tools for global knowledge, diplomacy, and expansion. Nixon was not the first to insert color television into the Cold War imaginary. The head of RCA, David Sarnoff, for one, had long been tying the development of color to nationalistic pursuits. During the dedication of NBC's newly converted Washington, D.C. color station in 1958, Sarnoff gave a speech wherein he inferred that the Soviets had shied away from color television technology because of its presumed inherent relationship to veracity. And so we can watch this here.
Persons in the world who may not be very keen about being seen in their true and natural colors. Some of their pronouncements may on occasion bring a blush even to their own cheeks. And this camera, I assure you, sir, is relentless in its revelations. Happily, however, this is not so in America. Here we fear no revelations. We have nothing to hide. On the contrary, we want everyone in the world to see America in its true and natural colors. We want the people everywhere to see Americans at work and at play, to see our institutions in action, reflecting their ideals and the ideals of our nation, as well as our human imperfections. Here, we do not seek to be anything other than what we are. And what we are is not hidden by curtains, nor what we say screened by censorship.
So in this speech, Sarnoff places electronic color at the center of a Cold War visual regime and culture of surveillance, aligning it with the camera's relentless ability to both reveal truth and shine a light on those who might wish to hide in the dark or behind an iron curtain. Nixon, too, referred, although in a less ominous tone, to color TV's potential to reveal Khrushchev and the truths of Soviet life. Sarnoff's speech uses one of the technological idiosyncrasies of television, its tendency to pick up colors like red in the human flesh that may not be seen easily by the human eye, to claim that electronic color camera has a capacity to locate human imperfections and naturalness as it scrutinizes its subject and offers verisimilitude to its viewers. Therefore, its gaze, according to Sarnoff's logic, could not be tolerated by the secretive, deceitful, oppressive, and perpetually lurking communists. It could, however, be embraced by the naturally vibrant capitalist America, rich in values, goods, and democratic ideals, and with, quote unquote, nothing to hide. Here, color TV is not just a tool for selling or a heightened viewing experience, it's also an idealized and efficient technology of the production of knowledge, truth, detection, and revelation. One of the primary lines of arguments threaded throughout Bright Signals is that color television was imagined and sold as a new way of seeing on multiple fronts, distinct from both monochrome television and other forms of color media. It not only represented a new aesthetic for television, but also promised a peculiar viewing experience for audiences. Even though color TV was not broadcast in 3D or even high definition during the years before 1970, there was a consistent assertion made about its dimensionality and the way that it invited viewers to completely immerse themselves in the image in a manner similar to the way that IMAX or 3D technologies are discussed today. Fabric textures were said to pop, the reflection of bodies on waters shimmered, and dancers in their costumes revealed new level of subtlety and expressiveness in movement. The viewer felt transported, her senses stimulated on a multitude of levels. Color TV was said to produce a unique level of depth and immersion, not even found in color film, and was often described as having a pseudo-stereo effect, or giving the illusion of being in 3 dimensions. This sense of immersion rose out of the way that electronic color images were said to overwhelm the senses, refine and enhance vision, and expand horizons. This discursive framing was very much a part of the overall selling and reception of color TV in its first couple of decades as a new media technology. While in 1960s color television, these purported abilities and qualities of electronic color were considered to be best displayed in nature, art, or travel documentaries, like those produced by National Geographic, which provided spectacular views on both natural and man-made landscapes. But color television's promise of an immersive and intimate level of visual proximity fostered its developments in fields outside of entertainment too, most notably medical education. And I've written a couple of articles now on the use of color medical television, which really started in 1948 and was sold too as a heightened way of seeing, even for surgeons, but also for medical students. Praised for offering an ability to virtually transport medical students to an ideal viewing position of live surgery or other medical event, for being able to transmit live and large-scale microscopic images from one location to another for diagnostic purposes, and for enabling medical practitioners to see what they otherwise could not on microscopic images through the manipulation of color and light, electronic color promised to improve upon medical vision and the traditional surgical amphitheater experience. Coupled with the claims about its distinctive form of vision, color TV was said to have a unique psychological and emotional hold over viewers that made them more attentive, engaged, and open to the images and claims made before them. These beliefs about the power of color TV were sold to advertisers and audiences by the networks and manufacturers in an effort to get them on board with the color project. And so you can see in this slide, for example, it says, today's housewife responds most favorably when color television enters the picture. No other medium warms as many senses as color TV. And it says extra senses later in the ad too. In the early 1960s, the psychological and visual attentiveness of color TV viewers was explored in a study done by researchers at the Institute for Motivational Research, headed up by the era's best-known consumer behavioral analyst and referred to some as the Sigmund Freud of the supermarket age, Ernest Stichter. Here's an example of one of his questions. The resulting 157-page report, yes, this was supposed to be a way to get at the emotions of viewing that it feels when you're watching color TV. The resulting 157-page report served as an argument for advertisers to immediately enthusiastically turn to color in the production of their commercials. It claimed to have proven that color, when compared to black and white, increased the amount of time audiences watch television, the level of prestige and awareness of sponsors and their products, and purchase action, the desire and motivation for a viewer to purchase the product advertised. And in ferreting out the modalities, this is the psychological and sociological advantages of color, the report continued on to make detailed claims about the psychological process and of the meaning and reception of color, both on television and more generally. Like other studies on color viewing, it asserted the connection between color and increased visual and psychological attentiveness. However, it took it a step further, claiming that color television inspired in viewers a reduced sense of psychological distance, while also increasing levels of emotional involvement, empathy, creativity, comprehension, sociality, immediacy, a sense of three-dimensionality, and could intensify a sense of realism while simultaneously stimulating, quote unquote, a world of fantasy. Color was also found to be, quote, symbolic of innovation, progress, and modernity. Color, the report concludes, is symbolic of the better life. Color television was positioned as the ideal form of American consumer vision. This was called the Color Carousel, which you could walk in and see yourself on color TV at the World's Fair in 1964. A discursive construction that by 1960s has begun to intersect with Cold War rhetoric regarding surveillance and beliefs about truth-telling devices and technologies, like the earlier Nixon and Sarnoff examples. At that point, color TV came to also represent American scientific prowess and the ability to withstand seeing and being seen by a technology of revelation and veracity. I love her too at the end here. They're so performative. There's one of them that looks like he's from a 1960s TV show as he's performing for the camera. So what I want to move to is a brief discussion about how we see this in relationship to genre. And I go through this in one of the chapters in my book. And what was surprising is finding a sort of subgenre of documentaries in my research that I really felt like not many people had given much scholarly attention to. So the 1960s cultural documentary was a subgenre in which the form and function of color, especially related to the paradox of verisimilitude and sensual fantastical, is in high relief, referenced endlessly by critics and network executives. In contrast to those documentaries in black and white, the art, nature, and travel documentaries of this period have received little attention, even though they represent a significant portion of the decade's documentary programming. They too engaged with the world beyond US borders and sought to educate viewers. However, they also tracked in sensation, pleasure, and the spectacular. Beyond any cultural or political value they might have had, the documentaries were considered to be one of the most successful genres at highlighting the full advantages of electronic color as they brought together spectacle and vibrancy with a sense of cultural uplift and transportation. The creators of these programs were interested in crafting saturated landscapes of natural and artistic forms and placing them within educational narratives and historical frameworks. While a few of these productions were part of a series, most of them were one-off specials, moments of high investment. Oops, why do I keep? There's some here. This is where I want to be. Wait, where am I? Oh, here. Moments of high investment public interest programming that would please regulators, bring attention to color casting, as it was called, and allowed high-end sponsors to test out their relationship to color. They were also part of television's move towards the global, both in terms of the network's own desired expansion into foreign markets, but also the overall focus on internationalization in US corporate culture. So these are some examples of these types of, and you could just kind of look over the titles and get a sense of the subgenre. In using these documentaries to highlight color technology, the networks were selling an idea about color vision and its connection to expanding cultural, visual, and political horizons, while also emphasizing the sensual pleasures of travel, design, and consumption. The promotion of many of the cultural documentaries reveals comparable claims regarding electronic color's ability to, 1, intensify the pleasures already offered by monochrome television, 2, expand the visual and experiential horizons of viewers through explorations of the natural world, and 3, extend and refine television's technological vision, thereby bringing hereto under or unexplored subjects and knowledges to clear relief. Among other things, color television was packaged as a unique tool of scientific, artistic, and sometimes even political inspection. Color art documentaries in particular were thought to bring these qualities to the fore for audiences, positioning color as a necessity, and were therefore utilized in the years immediately preceding full conversion. Sorry. It's important to note that NBC's earliest nationwide color cast was, in fact, an art documentary. A visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1954 was a virtual tour hosted by the museum's director, Francis Henry Taylor. This is not that one, this is a later one. In reviews of the live broadcast from the Met, critics remarked that art on television was one of the few subjects that not only benefited color, it required it. Calling it a historic broadcast, the reviewer for Variety concluded that, quote, McCarthy versus the Army won't look any better in Spectrum, but Van Gogh's landscapes and the Cezanne's still life are something else again. Speaking directly to the relationship between the museum and his network's color objectives, NBC President Robert Sarnoff, in a 1965 speech to the Friends of the Whitney, predicted that, quote, the museum of the near future is the museum without walls, an open house of treasure that will be brought into millions of homes by color television. Color television is enjoying a fantastic boom, so is art. Both are interrelated. It's also interesting to recognize how monochrome television is skipped over in these moments, as though it is assumed that art can only be represented and appreciated in color. Rarely were such statements made about the absolute centrality of color to the legibility of other forms of televised art, such as theater or other forms of performance. From the earliest moments of color TV's conceptualization, one of its unique strengths was the representation of visual art forms such as painting, sculpture, and design. The vast majority of reviews of these art documentaries emphasize the role that color played not only in presenting a beautiful image, but also in assisting such an image to be completely legible when compared to monochrome. To the viewer interested in learning more about the craft, meaning, and history of art, period. In other words, the most common address of these programs was one that was educational and informational, specifically encouraging the development of a tasteful and learned eye in the viewer, interested in acquiring the skill of art appreciation. Color, nature, or wildlife series such as Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, the National Geographic specials, The World of Jacques Cousteau, and later The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, were in many ways extensions of popular nature photography and arguably connected to the color work of art photographers of the period like William Garnett and Roman Bizniak. They were also yet another iteration of the promise of color television to extend the eye of technology to places around the globe, underwater, into bodies, through a microscope, and eventually into space, reveling in the views that had been previously hidden or out of reach. So here's a list of just some National Geographic specials on CBS in the 1960s. At this point, CBS, all the networks had converted to color starting in the mid-60s. In looking at the list of National Geographic specials from 65 to 70, a number of things stand out. An emphasis on a mix of science and adventure, the assumed American perspective on the world, a clear notion of empire, domination of national resources, a fascination with sparsely populated, geographically unique, far-flung locales, and a repeated articulation of access to broadly defined and seemingly unified national domains. While this certainly resonates with other visual materials produced by the Society, it also stresses the endless horizon that color television technology was thought to afford. Critics were most impressed by the expansiveness and detail captured by color television in such expeditions. but also by the technological finesse and modifications that enable them to capture moving images of hippos traveling underwater on riverbeds, humans scaling Everest, and close-ups of birds flying midair. This is sort of similar to the way that like contemporary IMAX films also construct immersive experience through nature films. Technological finesse was part of the expertise on display in nature documentaries and accentuates the idea that these programs, when coupled with the new technology of color television, were advancing and augmenting vision in ways that were distinct from that of monochrome television. Wildlife filmmakers were often put in the position of coming up with their own workarounds. Wildlife filmmakers were often put in the position of coming up with their own workarounds to the challenges of filming in extreme micro and macro scale. One such filmmaker, Gerald Thompson, a British nature documentarian whose films were distributed by the U.S. In the U.S. by National Geographic, found that capturing insects, for example, on color film, presented two major logistical issues. In magnifying the picture, you would also magnify vibrations, and the amount of light required by color film could generate so much heat as to either injure or change the behavior of the insects being filmed. Thompson recalls that the production team on Disney's 1951 true life film, Nature's Half Acre, had chosen relatively large insects, caterpillars and praying mantis, that were more easily captured on screen with special equipment. However, they did not consistently control for the heat from the lights, and therefore, Thompson claims, the caterpillars on screen were seen writhing in their death throes because they were being cooked by the lights. Sorry. Instead of the predominantly first world places and objects explored in the travel and art documentaries, these nature programs would center on the flora, fauna, people, and nations deemed exotic to the vast majority of American viewers, which meant more often than not, they were landscapes and inhabitants of the developing world. The National Geographic specials were packaged as middle-brow armchair explorations of the beautiful yet untamed and uncivilized natural world through the eyes of explorers, expeditionists, anthropologists, and other experts. National Geographic's move to television was due in large part to the organization's own investment in and branding around color photography. The magazine itself, originally established as a journal of amateur science in 1888, expanded its reach and circulation and its editorial focus when it shifted into an accessible blend of science and popular entertainment, directed at the culturally aspirational middle-class magazine reader of the early 20th century. The increased use and space given to photography in the magazines was key to its developing reach and popularity. Its regular use of color photographs, almost exclusively taken with Kodachrome film until 2009, began in the late 1930s and served to both solidify its reliance on the visual and result in a branding of the publication in relationship to a specific type of photo essay, one that had some relationship to those that might be found in other photo-heavy magazines such as Life and Look, but also maintained its own unique and consistent form, content, and address. The use of color altered the nature of the magazine's approach to the acquisition and presentation of images, as its photographers began to select subjects on the basis of how vibrant they were, and even altering the dress of indigenous people in order to get a more striking color shot. This practice of National Geographic's photographers, which came to be referred to as the red skirt school of photography, since red was the favorite color for clothes on subjects, as it came out best in Kodachrome, only added to the reputation of color photography as frivolous, especially when it was contrasted to photojournalism, a field in which color photography did not gain wide acceptance for editorial purposes until the mid-1960s. Okay. Look at this for a second while I take a sip of water. These images probably look quite familiar to you. Color film equipment and other forms of technological innovation arguably played the biggest role in the Jacques Cousteau documentaries, which were also sponsored by National Geographic and Encyclopedia Britannica. While starting out as special presentations of National Geographic, the adventures of Cousteau and his crew would often spin off to a separate series, The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau on ABC. Cousteau had become a well-known figure through his best-selling book and Academy Award-winning documentary of the same name, A Silent World, which had, for the first time, brought color-filled cameras to the depths of the ocean. He was also known as a technological innovator, having invented the aqualung, a diving saucer, a vehicle which could travel 350 meters underwater, and designed cameras and modified film for underwater expeditions. Cousteau claimed to have put a portion of the $3.5 million given to him and his team by ABC for a minimum of 12 one-hour programs towards the creation of a one-man jet-propelled, I'm going to do this again. No, not going to work again. Okay. One-man jet-propelled subs outfitted with hydraulic claws, sounding gear, and radio equipment. 2 remote-controlled color cameras and a set of floodlights were also mounted on each sub, and multiple 16-miller cameras packaged into specially made torpedo-shaped cases were held by divers and added to sleds called troikas, which can film as much as 15,000 feet down. All of this technology enabled the team to, as the show put it, explore man's last frontier, and to follow Cousteau's often quoted motto, roughly, to translate from the French, we have no choice but to go and see, capturing both images of sweeping sea horizons as well as extreme close-up examinations of sea life. In the opening of most episodes of the series, the audience is introduced to a phenomenon for the team to investigate, such as the mass mating and procreation cycle of squid off the California coast. Much of the narration, both by Cousteau and the off-screen voice of Rod Serling in the series and Orson Welles in the specials, positioned the team's work as scientific observation and documentation. At the time of the program's airing, a number of reviewers marked on the way that the program immersed viewers into 2 hidden worlds, life under sea and the rhythms of daily life as part of a French crew of divers, oceanographers, technicians, cinematographers, and seamen. Yet the crew was not only positioned as experts and adventurers, but also occasionally as naive subjects, as witnessed in Cousteau's description of entering the coral jungle. Our first dive into a world so physically striking, quote, our first dive in a world so physically striking overwhelms our senses. We are no more explorers than children in a store filled with surprises. In these underwater documentaries, once again, color television alternately overwhelms the senses and enhances and refines vision, bestowing upon viewers the feeling they too have traveled into a world previously hidden from them, to become adventurers, to see for themselves a world beyond their reach. This sense is enhanced by Serling's narration as his voice has become synonymous with the introduction to the fictional sci-fi other worlds of the Twilight Zone. In the rhetoric around Undersea World and the actions and interests of Cousteau, we can also find an analogous relationship to the other hidden world adventures that color television would eventually document, and which was very much in the headlines during this period, space exploration. Cousteau's programs brought color television viewers deep underwater to explore a world unknown to them in a more extreme way than most other of the cultural documentaries of the time. However, the majority of the programs in this genre, whether centering on travel, art, or nature, were also engaged at some level in extending and expanding vision and experience through color. They blended markers of realism with that of the spectacular, allowing the technology of color television to be read as more immersive, experiential, and even emotional than its monochrome counterpart. Whether it was deep diving with Jacques Cousteau, traveling through Rome with Sophia Loren, or receiving a guided tour of the Louvre, these color casts encourage viewers to linger on the spectacular, realistic image before them, to increase their sense of being there and to temporarily submerge themselves in another world. This purported ability of color television to expose the spectacular real or natural as it extends human sight continues to play out in the context of color TV's 1960s global expansion through international displays, satellite technology, the adoption of color systems by other nations, and eventually its inclusion on the Apollo missions to the moon. So the arguments that I touched upon give shape and direction to bright signals, which is organized chronologically, starting at the period of invention and ending at the point in which the US networks have completed their conversion to color, and a significant portion of the audience owns color sets, which is 1970. This bracketing allows me to explore color television technology as a point of difference in the production and experience of television, and to investigate the various ways color was, over time, integrated into the industry's system of production and reception. Each chapter is organized around a particular issue or stage that define the industry's relationship to color at that specific moment. For example, innovation, standardization, calibration, conversion, and global expansion. The first half of the book focuses more overtly on the technology of color television, while the second brings that history and conceptual framing to bear in moments of more traditional cultural and industrial histories. Before the transition to digital, color was the most significant technological development in television. However, even though the technology's discursive positioning in relation to spectacular realism succeeded in selling it as a new and unique perceptual experience, the road to color's acceptance and dissemination was complex and rather arduous. Electronic color represented transformation, modernity, and media sensory integrity, which means that its history is not only one of industry, but also of a larger perceptual shift corresponding with cultural and political changes occurring during this period. However, overall, the history of color television reminds us to look more closely at those structuring elements that have become naturalized to our experience of popular mediums, whose histories we think we're already familiar with, and to ultimately discover previously untold facets of media transformations and new technologies. So thank you. That is the end of this formal presentation.
So we have plenty of time for some questions and answers. Any questions or comments for Sue?
I'm just wondering, so when it comes to like shooting underwater or shooting up close and the issues inherent in that, was the onus to like design workarounds put on users, or did the corporations come out with like ways around that? Like were people tinkering around to be able to film underwater?
Well, I mean, the example that we have, the real example that I'm looking at is Cousteau, and he was the one that was doing that
So
technology.
he, like,
Yes.
pushed that. And so then in terms too, like, what was that like mainly Cousteau? Or was that, I don't have trouble with that. Or was that like, once he did that, did the people that made the cameras start to realize like, oh, we can do more? Or was there like a culture of having to like bring them up? I'm just kind of
yes.
like tinkering with radio and stuff.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yes, I think there was, of course, so he makes the innovation, and then you show the use, and then there's an ability to market that more broadly. I think that's the answer. Although the real details about color cameras underwater was not part of, I didn't investigate it too much, but I think that was part of the process. What is right. Yeah.
Just to follow up, I wondered about that. Were those film cameras or were they
Yes.
video?
They were film cameras, and so that's part of this.
They get displayed on TV.
Yes, exactly.
Color TV.
So I'm also, I didn't sort of point to it, but I'm also, most of these clips that you saw were done on film for color television. And so color television as a technological object, right, as the both the set itself, but then also the cameras is one thing. But then what is shown sometimes is live programming, sometimes is filmed at that point. And so it's not live, programming done, video programming done from under.
That actually kind of connects to what I wanted to ask about, because I find one really interesting thing about this moment, right, is the tension between production and consumption, right? So
Yes.
how long it took for it to diffuse
Yes.
with consumers, right? So it's interesting, like you said, all these clips are actually the film clips. So I'm just so curious, like, how do we get at that history of perception, right? Because
Yes.
a lot of people weren't seeing it the way we're seeing it now, or even seeing it in color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so, well, here's a couple of things, is a lot of people who aren't seeing it in color, and in the color documentaries are a little bit later, they're in the 60s by the time, so we've got more people who have color, and the networks have converted by the late 60s. But, a lot of what how they're understanding audiences themselves are understanding colors through reviews. Of course, networks gave all the reviewers color televisions. And then they would describe what it was like to watch color, right? And they would say things like, watching Peter Pan, the spectacular Peter Pan, you really shouldn't be watching this on black and white, even though most people were. So they're having this diffused moment, but also color television, much like Anna McCarthy describes public TV for black and white, was also put in public places in order for people to have that experience. But it is an incredibly long period of dissemination, in part because the the other networks didn't have the investments that NBC did in relationship to RCA, right? And they were not going to profit off of color, so they were like, because it was also, you had to transform everything, convert everything for color production. It was very expensive. And sponsors were also not that interested in making the transition either. They had to really be convinced. Kathy?
I'm just curious, did you find any examples of, say, audiences objecting to color, saying,
Yes.
oh my God, it's too real, or oh, look at the blood, or
Yes.
oh, no, that's a...
Yeah, there was a lot of, well, mainly it was like, why? Do we really need it? So there was a lot of examples of people saying, like, why would I spend so much money to watch color? Because it was incredibly expensive compared to black and white. They might have just bought a black and white set. So often it's about, that's why I'm interested in how it's being sold, right? What are the things that are going to convince sponsors and audiences that you need a color TV, right? So part of the even description about, you know, a new form of perception is really in the packaging of like, this is what makes this a distinct technology from anything else. So when I was first doing my research, I was imagining, I would find something that's about like, this is a difference from black and white to television, but a lot of it is about like, this is a new thing altogether, right? And even from its earliest demonstrations, actually, in the 1920s, some of that was, this is a new thing, and it's actually so complex, it's gonna have to wait until we can kind of perfect black and white, which is a simpler technology to develop. But yes, the question of reception is so interesting and how people understood, but there was a lot of like, color television wasn't gonna work, it's not worth it. I have to tune in. Sometimes the networks had different, they looked different in color. They were using different kind of color palettes. Tuning color on the set was very complex and involved. So it required a lot of consumer input into producing an image that was related to, that had some kind of high fidelity.
I'm wondering about the relationship between how much you've investigated or thought about the relationship between the film and television industries. Yeah. And you know, knowing that Hollywood doesn't begin to produce, I think the first year that more than half the films were in color was 53. Yeah. And a lot of that was in response to television. And I'm just wondering, you know, how that played out. I'm also thinking about the fact that that if I remember correctly, it was an NBC primetime Wizard of Oz, 57 was the first, which was a very big deal at the time. Just how that relationship between these two culture industries and these two technologies developed.
Well, one thing, what I immediately think about is the way that NBC learned from the experience of Hollywood, right? In terms of, they had production workshops about how to use color, and a lot of the language was things that Hollywood had already learned, like how to use color carefully, how to not be garish and excessive, right? How to use it only when it mattered, but also production techniques and so forth, lighting that they picked up from Hollywood, makeup, so kind of calibration on the set, which is something that they're picking up from Hollywood. So the networks are learning from that experience. They're also thinking about learning from the experience that I know that the idea of producing color films would be more expensive. Is it going to produce enough of a difference at the box office to make that worth it, right? And so that would maybe only be limited to particular genres. And so that generic combination, a relationship is also present, that television is learning, yes, color documentaries, but also spectaculars, musicals, things that also that car companies can advertise on and have different color cars. So it's both from, a lot of the things I'm considering are from the television industry's point of view and not as much as Hollywood. But there is some tension there in terms of the distinction, film being this visual, this object of spectacular visual experience, television always being okay, but really about live, more about live transmission. But the aesthetic of television on the set is not so good. And here it's this moment where television is asserting itself aesthetically a bit more.
I think so. We read this in my TV studies class last semester. We really enjoyed it. Many of the students are here from that. And I'm just curious how you came across sort of doing this project in the first place. And what directions you ended up going that you might not have expected that you would go, if there were ways that you went.
That's such a good question. I came, the reason I did it was because of a graduate student. a graduate student I had, Carolyn Kane, who ended up writing, her book dissertation was published. She was writing about video and art color in the 1960s. And she wanted some prehistory material. She said, well, what is available on color television? And I said, you know what, I know there's all this kind of color wars thing. Let me look. And I realized there was just nothing. And I kept looking. And then when I started looking at some of the primary materials, I realized there is so much here and I had no idea. And so then I started to see the project. And so first it's like that first layer of, I'm looking at articles from the time and I see, I'm starting to get a sense of the chronology and its impact and its significance, and then going deeper into archives. And so I didn't expect to go on a documentary thing. I realized that I had to have my own prehistory that talked about the history of standardization of color, but not in such only just the color wars way, that tied that to a larger history of color standardization. So those were some of the, but really in general, the most surprising thing was how much material was out there that nobody had gone to look at. And it's one of those projects that afterwards you're like, of course, but before that, I'd never considered it either, before that kind of question, and it took me on this deep dive. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for this. It's fascinating. I'm curious what role sports programming had in developing the sort of selling of and the need for color TV, because tennis balls are yellow so that you can see them on screen.
Absolutely. For sports, it was about legibility. Mm-hmm. And so that was the reason, is you can now, now you can go to the baseball game, but really not only see it from a better position than you would if you were in the stands, but now you can also distinguish the things that you really needed to distinguish before, the colors of the uniforms, the teams, etc. So it was really an argument for what it provides in terms of legibility and understanding what's going on in a way that other programming might not, except for some of the art stuff too. There is about legibility too.
I have lots more questions, but I'll try to. So the what, from your perspective, what drove ultimately? What were the kind of main drivers, and how important was programming in terms of? And I'm thinking of Disney going to that wonderful color. I'm thinking of NBC Peacock and what a big deal that was, and Bonanza. And how important the car ads were on Bonanza. And how those were those are the kinds of shows that I tend to think of, very late 50s, early 60s. Were those the key drivers? And so and then my related question kind of is NBC and RCA, and how much was that relationship? How important was that to driving this industry toward color?
That was incredibly important, because it was also RCA was subsidizing the production of color for NBC. So it was giving them the funds to not only make the conversions, but also giving sponsors deals to have color commercials at the same cost as black and white, even though they were more expensive to produce, so that sponsors could learn that color was better for them. So they targeted particular sponsors like rug companies, makeup companies. Food companies were a little iffy because they were worried about would the color match what was in the store. So they had to do this. They had to convince them by giving them discounted sponsorship. So RCA is funding all of this, and they're also funding NBC to do, giving them money to produce programs on their own that could also be shown during the day. That was a surprise for me. I realized they needed something to show in the store. So there was daytime color, because that's when color, But definitely Disney by 1961, that's a big moment, and it worked so well with their brand as like, we're the technological innovators. So Wonderful World of Disney was first Wonderful World of Color, Bonanza 2, but it was really NBC. Nobody else was, because they had won the standard, they were for a decade doing color when it was at a loss. In 1956, Time magazine had said this was the biggest industrial flop of our generation, was color television. Mm-hmm. So then they just kept doing it. And in the memos, they would say like, this is 1953 is it's color programming year. And they would have very specific plans about what they would, it will be spectaculars. It will be this, it will be things that what sponsors want. Car companies were a big part of it because you could show the new color cars, right? And it's also coming at this post-war moment where consumer goods are starting to be in various different colors, right? Big items like appliances and cars. But yeah, it's very much a part of that.
So I don't know a ton about like the specifics of technology, but I know like it's easy with hindsight to say, you know, you start with black and white and then you go into color. But one of the big things we talked about in at least the television class was that nothing is really inevitable, right?
Yes.
And so
right.
I was kind of curious about like how the process of being interested in making color film and television came about, as opposed to just kind of being this accepted thing of, oh, life is in color, but film is always going to be in black and white. Like,
yes.
Was it always an end goal for these people, or how did it come to be this scientific and technological event?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, to always be suspicious of those narratives, and I tried to, be suspicious of them in myself as it was going on. But I did see it even in the 1920s with the early innovators, is they saw it as the ultimate end point in some way, because it was the full sensory experience, right? And if the technology was there, you wanted sound, you wanted movement, you wanted color, because it would be as real, like real life. But so that was part of their discussions, but they had so many problems with the technology. Sometimes there were moments they could kind of perfect it, but liveness also, there was lots of interference. Interference would shift colors in ways that were really problematic. And so it was always like, how could you present real color? It was so difficult for so long that just like, we'll get there eventually. It was often the, I think, thing around color. Eventually we'll be at color. But in the meantime, let's move to black and white. It's a good question.
I hope this question, thank you so much for this. This is super fascinating. And the question I have is not necessarily about content, and I hope it's not too in the weeds, but along the same lines of what Elisa was asking, you mentioned at the outset that you had obtained some grants to cover the cost of the color images in the book. And so I also was, as I was looking on your website, you also have a beautiful kind of web presence for this book, right, that contains a bunch of images and some of the videos that you showed. Yeah. But as I was watching your presentation, something I don't think we talk about a lot is this sort of where our work ends up living.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you have a project that is this visual and so dependent on sort of having color, and it says on your website there are over 100 color images.
Yes. Yeah.
Woo!
Yeah.
I just know in negotiating with various presses, how did you approach that whole process? When you're approaching a project that is this visual, this dynamic, how do you think about like where it lives, either in digital spaces or how you manifest that in the actual printed work?
Well, when I signed the contract with Duke, I mean, I didn't say, they just made it clear, like, we could do two things. We could have an insert. If you had to do color images all throughout the book, it changes the type of paper you use. And so it cost $10,000. Yeah. So, and if you, like, what, I was going to get an advance of 1,000, a couple thousand. So, so I just thought I will collect, as there's publication subvention grants that there's a Humanities Institute at NYU that I won. I cobbled together a series of those to actually finally, I kept collecting and collecting over years to finally, I think I had to cap off the last bit with my own research fund, and that was fine because I was that. But it did have this feeling of self-publishing, that I'm like collecting money to get my own book published.
I don't think we talk about it very frequently.
No, it's true.
Fascinating to hear someone's process.
Yeah.
And I just want to say it's the most beautiful book I've ever seen for an academic.
Thanks. Well, that's also why I wanted to go with Duke, is because I feel like they make beautiful books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They did a nice job.
Thank you. But it also involved a lot of, the issue was, of course, permissions. Yeah. But a lot of things were, well, it was exhausting. But a lot of things, too, like the ads and things that were still fair use. But there's a number of tunnels I had to go through and get money for that, too. But those were minimal compared to the other, the bigger expense of the paper. Mm-hmm.
Kind of on that same topic of process, so as someone else who's studying technology, one of the challenges I always find is as not a trained engineer.
Yes, oh God, yes.
Right? And like you get into the archive and there are a lot of and it's difficult to access materials. How did you kind of work your way around?
Yeah, I really felt like I had to keep descriptions open on the page while I was trying to understand certain things and while I was writing. And this, the real technical aspects of it, I still cannot speak very easily myself. It's like learning a language, but you only got to do it, in a sense, to write it. But my My verbal use of that language is not so good. So it's not like I know that it didn't become a part of me, but it was a real struggle to even just go into the archives and understand what they were talking about. Another thing that was really helpful, though, for television technology, there's a whole world of engineers. You know, I make this argument in this other article I wrote about how the technology of the history of the technology of television has really been written by engineers, and there's a community of engineers out there that are all there that from this period. And the problem was the one that I really needed to talk to. He died right before we were supposed to speak about this, because it's an age thing at this point. That he did this Fred Astaire. He won an Emmy for a Fred Astaire thing, and then he kept track his Ed Rattan, and it's still on the web, of like this color history that he has pictures of cameras and details about what those cameras are like. So that turned out to be another source for me, and following their conversations online as well. So that was part of it. But certainly the interpretation of materials is definitely difficult.
Any questions? Sue, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.